At first glance, it seems that sleep debt could be defined with a simple equation. The number of hours we need to sleep minus the number of hours we actually sleep equals the deficit or debt we incur in our sleep. It seems very simple. I sleep little during the week and then sleep it all off during the weekend, so the debt is paid off. Or I play video games an hour less to get to sleep earlier and everything is fine. It turns out that sleep debt is a much bigger problem than having concentration issues the day after a sleepless night. It is not a bank. We're not talking about money or paying interest, especially when you work 2 or 3 jobs. Today we will take a look at why sleep debt can be dangerous. We will talk about 3 facts and 3 myths about the lack of sleep, and 6 tips that will help you get out of that endless debt cycle. Honestly, sleep debt can kill you. I learned the term sleep debt from William Cement, a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, in his book, The Promise of Sleep. He is recognized as the father of sleeplessness research. We're actually using some of his work in our animations. I also learned the most dangerous concept, the dreaded microsleep. We will talk about it later in more detail. What is sleep debt? Let's define it. Sleep debt is the deficit of sleep, the accumulation of the hours our body needs to sleep, but is deprived of it, and the accumulation of the effects of that deprivation. It is more than a simple analogy of economic terms because, as I mentioned earlier, we are not talking about a simple loan that we can repay easily. No, the interest on this debt is exorbitant. We could almost call it a robbery. Unfortunately, the consequences of sleep debt can be very serious, even fatal. Let's talk about 3 myths and 3 facts of sleep debt. Later, I will tell you what we can do about it and how we can get out of this unhealthy cycle. Myth number 1. Our body will adapt. We think that humans are capable of incredible adaptability. We adapt to cold, heat, humidity, to veganism, etc. This sense of pride in our ability to adapt is amplified by the great achievements of explorers, the surprising cases of survivors who spent weeks without eating, people who spent years in concentration camps or gulags, shipwrecks, and so on. All this gives us an image of adaptability to the most disastrous of circumstances. In many cases, we manage to pay off a micro-debt of a night spent working, studying, or playing, with a long and pleasant night of sleep on a weekend. So what is the problem? How many times have I heard my friends say, "I'm used to sleeping 6 hours per night and I wake up rested"? Well, let me tell you that you may think that, but you are not rested. Each of those survival adaptations has a strong impact on the health of the person who experiences traumatic circumstances. In any case, those who did not survive will not make the next Netflix series. I don't deny that the body has the ability to regenerate itself and return to normal. But situations where we are deprived of calories, vitamins, sleep, water, etc., are abnormal and no organism will adapt to those situations indefinitely. Lack of sleep is essentially a critical situation, and to adapt, the body has to activate its survival mechanisms. In this case, the body's survival mechanisms are microsleep, excessive eating, limiting contact with others, slowdown of metabolism, focus on survival. Of course, this doesn't happen randomly. Our endocrine system is responsible for directing these biochemical processes. We believe we are masters of productivity, but we cannot fool our hormones. We can't normalize our lack of sleep. It just doesn't work that way. Now, before the comment section explodes, I would like to present a 2010 study by a team of researchers under the supervision of Daniel Cohen. The study aimed to measure the impact of chronic lack of sleep on our performance. In the introduction, the author mentions the popular belief about the adaptation to lack of sleep. The results showed a 30% reduction in response time compared to the control group. This translates to lack of concentration, being distracted, or experiencing lethargy of thought. People who don't sleep enough generally don't notice these changes. But one sleepless night can affect sugar metabolism or fat storage for weeks. We have several biological clocks that regulate different processes in different ways. Not sleeping one night has serious consequences. It can have worse consequences than visible risks such as smog. A recent study in Sweden, supervised by Jonathan Cedernes of the University of Uppsala, points to the difficulty of reversing the catabolic processes of skeletal muscles. This leads to obesity and muscle weakness. And the processes do not reverse when you try to recharge your sleep bank. Unfortunately, that is a process that takes much more time. Myth number 2. Lack of sleep is not responsible for all diseases in the world, but the list of diseases caused by the lack of sleep is extensive. People who sleep will also get sick. We think that sleeping is not so important. Some nights we don't sleep, or we work at the computer until midnight and wake up at 6 in the morning. We tell ourselves, that's life. Technically, lack of sleep is not responsible for that endless list of diseases, but it is a factor that triggers very negative changes in our body. When we miss sleep, the body enters a crisis mode in which our appetite increases. The body tries to provide regenerative substances in other ways because we don't produce them due to lack of sleep. We desynchronize our entire endocrine system. We produce ghrelin, a hormone that increases the periods of fatigue and is responsible for increasing appetite, while at the same time we produce less leptin that normally acts to alter food intake and control energy expenditure over the long term. This process of increasing the production of some hormones and reducing others is very complicated, but it is most important to note that we do not have much control over it. It works that way when we need more sleep. Lack of sleep also generates high level of cortisol, the hormone responsible for managing crises in our body. It limits our regenerative and metabolic functions to focus on survival processes. High levels of cortisol increase the number of cytokines in our body. These proteins react to inflammations caused by lesions. At the same time, they cause muscle weakness, fatigue, and joint pain. If the situation is chronic, it can cause symptoms similar to the early stages of influenza. As the body is in a state of crisis, the increase in cortisol leads us to accumulate fluids and fats. It also lowers the level of testosterone that is responsible for sexual appetite in both men and women. So far, we have talked about some hormones and how their presence or absence in our body increases appetite, leads to the accumulation of fluids and fats, which in turn cause obesity, which then leads to medical problems, and we can end up with a terminal disease. Lack of sleep can limit our sexual appetite. It causes us irritability, weakness, and lack of productivity. 1 or 2 hours less sleep per night can cause shortness of breath, obesity, or a heart attack at 40. It can also affect our personal relationships or even cause depression. Myth number 3. Lack of sleep can kill you. I talked about microsleep at the beginning of this video. It is one of the strategies of a tired organism to recover from daily activities. The easiest way to identify microsleep is when we unintentionally drift off in the middle of a lecture at the university or when someone tells us a boring story. We do not actually fall asleep, but we look at the horizon and remain motionless while the body relaxes and the mind empties. The problem is that we do not control this process. We are between dream and reality. We may even remember what the speaker was talking about. This usually occurs when the body is static and we try to concentrate on something specific. But imagine you're driving on a highway. Now you can appreciate the danger of microsleep. This is one of the main causes of accidents. It only takes a moment of monotony in which we are trying to concentrate on the driving and we fall into microsleep. If this happens at the wrong moment, we can cause a serious accident. Lack of sleep can affect our interpersonal relationships and increase our irritability. Our intellectual capacity is limited and we're less patient. This affects our interpersonal relationships over the long term. Our self-esteem can be affected, and that in turn could cause depression. Lack of sleep lowers the quality of life. We cannot repay our debt by sleeping all weekend. We will not be able to recover our interpersonal relationships, our deregulated hormones, or our bad diet. Interest on that debt accumulates too. What should we do to avoid these unpayable debts? How can we regenerate after long periods of sleep deprivation? Well, here's some advice. Make sure you sleep 7 to 9 hours. If you only sleep 4 to 6 hours per night, you will accumulate more than 90 hours of sleep deficit in a single month. 2. Melatonin helps us sleep. It is called the Dracula hormone because it is activated at night. Any artificial light decreases its production even 1 hour after turning off our devices. If you go to bed immediately after looking at a television or computer screen, thinking that you're going to sleep for 8 hours, you will actually sleep for only 7 hours. If we sleep well, we exercise better, and if we exercise better, we sleep well. If you've ever exercised after a bad night's sleep, you know that the body reacts slowly and refuses to cooperate. This is due to reduced levels of the growth hormone. This hormone is responsible for our muscle regeneration. The lower the production of growth hormone, the greater the weakness. In turn, exercising regulates our body temperature. A few hours after exercising, our body cools, producing a pleasant sleep. Exercise prepares the body for resting. 4. Make sure the room is dark, quiet, and cool. The ideal temperature for resting is around 20 degrees Celsius, 68 Fahrenheit. 5. Make sure nothing interferes with your sleep. When you keep a regular sleeping schedule, you eliminate the need for alarms. You will wake up at the same time every day. 6. Don't drink coffee 10 hours before bedtime, and don't eat anything heavy 4 hours before bedtime. Cleaning the body of caffeine takes 10 hours, and there is nothing worse than trying to rest while your digestive system is working. Alcohol consumption obviously does not help with that either. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the content of this video. Share it with anyone you think is missing some extra hours of sleep. I hope that after watching this animation, you will finally establish a good sleeping routine and stop accumulating sleep debt. Thank you for your time, and remember, be extraordinary.